From Focal Point Radio and WEBR in Fairfax, Virginia, this is the Mimi Geerges Show. Author Nicholas Carr posed this question in an article for The Atlantic. Is Google making us stupid? That set off a debate on the effects the internet is having on our brains. Obviously, the internet is here to stay, but is it making us scatterbrained? Are we losing the ability to think deeply? What about kids and teens who spend a lot of time online? The benefits of the internet are real and they are plentiful. But Nick Carr says they come at a price. His book is called The Shallows, and he joins me in the studio. Then later in the program, a frank discussion on today's pornography and the impact it's having on our boys and men. But first, Nicholas Carr. Nick, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much.
You said that you had actually felt that your brain was changing and that you weren't thinking the way that you used to. Explain that.
Well, a few years ago, I noticed when I'd sit down to read a book or simply to think about something that I was having trouble concentrating. My mind would start wandering. I'd want to get more stimuli in or whatever. And I began to make a connection between my inability to concentrate and all the time I had been spending online. Because what I realized is, when I sat down to read a book, for instance, which used to come naturally to me, my mind wanted to behave the way it behaved online. It wanted to jump from page to page, start finding links to click on, do Googling, check email. So I realized that all my internet use, like a lot of people, I've gained a lot of benefits from it, was really changing the way I think and in the way my mind works in kind of a disconcerting way.
But why do you blame the internet for that? Maybe life is just more complicated.
I thought about that, and I think I don't want to place all the blame for my thinking patterns on the net. But nevertheless, what was clear to me isn't just that I was distracted or just that I was thinking about other things, but I wanted to behave. My brain wanted to behave exactly as it behaves when it's online or when it's looking into an iPhone or something. It didn't want to stay put on one thing. It was almost as if it was hungry for information of lots of types and coming at me quickly. So my hypothesis was that these two things were related, my net use and my inability to concentrate. And then the more I looked at kind of the science of the brain and even the history of technology, the more reasons I found to be really concerned.
Well, let's talk about the history of technology, because you call the internet, quote, mind-altering technology. If we were to go back in history, are there other technologies that did the same thing to our brains? For instance, does listening to the radio alter your brain?
I think pretty much anything we do alters our brain to some degree. I mean, because, we're always learning, we're always adapting to a situation. But what we know now from recent scientific studies of the brain is that our brains can actually change at a very deep cellular level in response to our experiences, in response to the tools we use. The actual neuronal connections, the actual connections between our brain cells can get stronger or weaker depending on what we do and what we don't do. And I think if you look back through history, you can see that it's a very fascinating kind of story of how the tools we use to think with, so to speak, and going back to maps and clocks and onto books and to the internet, actually do change in sometimes in very profound ways the way that we think.
Well, the idea that the brain can change, that's what you were calling plasticity in the book. Explain that. How does, with repeated activity, the brain physically actually changes?
This is a big surprise, actually, in the world of neuroscience, in the world of brain science. Up until about 40 years ago, the assumption was that your neural pathways were all laid when you were very young. And by the time, and for instance, I learned this in school, by the time you were about 20, the thinking went. you couldn't change those pathways. They were kind of wired in, and you couldn't grow any new brain cells or anything. What we've learned since then is, in fact, that the brain is plastic, as neuroscientists say, or malleable or adaptable. And what happens is that the brain is very good at changing in response to changes in our habits. And what happens is, say you use one tool or something, or practice one way of thinking, and you do it repeatedly, what the brain does is it strengthens the neural circuits that support that activity. And by that I mean it actually puts extra chemicals into the synapses between our neurons that strengthen the connection, and also we actually literally grow new neuronal connections that support that particular activity. On the other hand, if we don't practice some way of thinking or even behaving, the brain basically says, oh, we don't need these circuits anymore, and it begins to use them for other purposes. So it's almost a use it or lose it type of thing.
But when you say lose it, is it gone for good? I mean, once we become these internet people that can't seem to concentrate or think about something for a very long time, is that gone?
It's not gone for good necessarily, because the brain will adapt back if we change our behavior. But if we don't change our behavior, if we keep going down the same path and actually use the net more and carry it with us in our pocket and kind of work in this perpetual state of distractedness that more and more of us tend to find these days, then it won't come back. The only way to get it back is to practice and to exercise, force yourself and to exercise those ways of thinking.
But as we become more and more distracted and our brains kind of change, don't we go back to how our ancestors used to be? I mean, they were always constantly distracted by, danger or food sources, and
Right.
that was a good thing for them.
Right, and that's kind of the surprising thing, I think, about what's happening to us today. We tend to think of it in terms of progress. We're always getting better, we're always getting smarter. But you could argue, and this is kind of the argument I lay out in my book, that actually we are going back to a more primitive way of thinking. When you think back to our distant ancestors, and the ability to pay attention to one thing was actually dangerous. If you sat there looking at one thing, you'd get attacked by a predator or clubbed over the head or whatever. So I think our brains naturally want to pay attention to a whole lot of things going on around us and to shift our focus constantly. And I argue that the ability to pay attention for a lot of us, for a lot of civilization, to one thing really was a recent development in the history of the brain. And one thing that helped us do that was the arrival of the book. The book is very interesting as technology because nothing else is going on. There's just the words on the page. And reading books helped train our minds to pay attention to one thing, to shield out distractions. The net, on the other hand, inundates us with distractions. And so it kind of encourages that more primitive way of thought that we share with our distant, caveman and cavewomen ancestors, where we are constantly shifting our focus, constantly juggling tasks, trying to pay attention to as much as possible.
Author Nicholas Carr is in the studio with me. It's spelled Carr. The book is called The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. Well, what about memory? Our ability to remember things that either we see online or otherwise, is it being impacted by our online time?
I think it is. One thing you learn from the science of memory is that storing memories is actually a very fragile kind of process in the brain. It requires us to there's two types of memory in our brains. There's short-term memory, also called working memory, and then there's long-term memory. And short-term memory is just where all the stimuli we receive, second by second, is stored very briefly. In order to transfer information from that short-term store to long-term memory requires us to be very attentive. You have to pay attention to something in order to store it in your long-term memory. And we all experience this in our day-to-day lives. If you're thinking of something, then you're distracted, it can vanish from your mind very quickly.
Or forgetting the name of somebody that you've just met.
Right. Or when you get up because you want to go to the next room to do something, and then you take 2 steps and you can't remember what you were going to do. It's because, these things are stored. It's because we're distracted, and then we forget what we were setting out to do. And, one of the things that scares me about the net and other digital media is that it's constantly bombarding us with information. And there's much good about that. This is often information that's valuable to us, but because it's constantly bombarding us with information, we can never, it becomes harder and harder to move information from the short-term memory, where it vanishes quickly, to our long-term memory. And unfortunately, in that scenario, what we lose is a lot of the depth of our thinking and the depth of our ideas and our conceptual knowledge, because that only happens when we are able to get information into our long-term memory and begin to weave it with all the other facts and experiences.
So it impacts how we learn. In other words, we get more and more information, but we're actually retaining less knowledge.
Right. Comprehension goes down, understanding goes down, and ultimately learning goes down as well.
It's funny, just as an aside, moms of little kids, we always joke about having mommy brain, right? We can't remember anything. We can't think about anything. And I realize it's because we're constantly distracted by our children.
Right. And, if you're looking after a young child, you don't want to concentrate on something else, and pay all your attention. So you need to be constantly shifting your focus. So the internet is by no means, and the web is by no means the first thing in our lives that is distracting us. But what it does is it kind of adds this huge new batch of distractions to our already distracted lives, and it just gets worse and worse.
But at the same time, there's the net to help you with that, because you don't have to remember things. You can just look it up online.
Right. And for a lot of stuff, phone numbers and things like that, it doesn't really matter whether you look it up online or whether you have it memorized. But there's also kind of the deeper conceptual knowledge, the more distinctive ideas and thoughts we have. And those you can't just go out and mine on the internet. You can't just Google up deep thoughts and deep ideas. Those really require us to get information deep into our mind, deep into our memory, and begin making internal connections with our other experiences, with other things we know. And if we short-circuit that process, we can find all sorts of facts easily online, but we never develop that deep, distinctive, conceptual knowledge.
I think it was interesting. You said something in the book about, we're not seeing the forest, we're not seeing the trees, we're actually just seeing the leaves and the twigs. The internet just gives us that little piece that's relevant to our search, whatever we searched for, and that's it.
Right, and that's what, on the one hand, that's what's very convenient and valuable about the web and about Google and about all these tools, is we can very quickly find that particular fact or, the map we were looking for or the recipe or whatever. But it's so efficient that you lose some of the context for information. You get the facts, but you lose the big picture, and that's a danger when we come to rely on the web as kind of our main or even our only information source. We get little bits of information, but we never weave it together into the bigger picture.
Well, let's talk about books, because you did mention that before. We've seen the drastic decline of newspapers because more and more people are getting their news online. Is the printed book going away? I mean, is the book going to die?
Well, so far, the printed book has held up pretty well compared to, say, newspapers and magazines, other print media. And I think it's because, even though the book's been around for hundreds of years, as a technology, which is what it is, it's actually very useful. It's easy to read printed words on the page. You don't need a battery for a book. If you drop it, it's not going to, you're not going to have to replace it for a couple of $100s. So far, the book has held up pretty well. But I think we're starting to see signs that we're moving away from, even in book form, the printed book, and moving more toward, if we read books at all, more toward either text on the internet or toward electronic books, that we look at through our Amazon Kindle or our Apple iPad. And
well, what about that? I mean, if we were to take a book and put it online, do we read it the same way, or is there a change?
I think there is a change, and I think the act of reading changes even when you take purely the text of a book and put it onto a screen. And the reason is that as soon as we move something onto the screen, it becomes embedded or interwoven into all the distractions that come through our computers. So even if we have a beautiful replication of a page of text on our screen, we probably also have email going on. We may have other applications running at the same time. Publishers now say they want to put videos into books because they can as soon as you put them on the screen. So the danger here is that you have the same content, but you begin to read it in a much more distracted way as it moves from the printed page to the screen.
And do you think authors will change the way that they write?
I think inevitably, if readers change the way they read, authors will change the way they write.
How?
Well, let's say you're an author, and in the past, you've been able to assume that there would be a very attentive book reader out there who would actually, he or she would, sit down with a book and immerse themselves in that book and read long stretches at once without a lot of distractions. If you were that author, you could begin to take chances. You could begin to experiment with stories. You could get into some complex syntax and vocabulary because you knew that the reader would stick with you. Now think about today and that same author. If the assumption is that the reader is going to be perpetually distracted and not be able to follow one story or one line of argument without juggling a lot of different tasks, I think you move away from experimentation and sophistication and literary elegance and move toward a more simple style, a more utilitarian style that people can, glance at and glance away from and not totally lose the thread. So I think, unfortunately, we'll probably, as writers adapt, we'll move toward a less interesting approach to literary expression.
The book we're discussing is called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, and author Nicholas Carr is in the studio with me. Nick, is this book being published electronically?
It is, and I have mixed feelings about that, but these days, if you want to publish a book, you almost always have to also give out the ebook. So, yep.
What about hypertext, which is the links that, take you to relevant content? Doesn't that, what it's supposed to do is to enhance and enrich your knowledge, gives you context for things, gives you other things so that you get a bigger picture.
Right, and that was for a long time the assumption about hypertext. And, the link, the ability to link between different pages or different bits of information is really the fundamental characteristic of the web. That's how we navigate the web, by clicking on links. But something interesting has come out of scientific studies of what happens when we put links into text, and that is that, on the one hand, it makes it a lot easier to jump around between pieces of relevant information, and that's good. But on the other hand, what it's been shown to do is, as soon as you put links into text, the links act as even more distractions, and that's not just a matter. They're not just distracting when we actually click on them and then jump to a new page. They're distracting even when we don't click on them. And what appears to happen is that the brain's the part of the brain that solves problems and makes decisions, every time we come to a link has to kind of kick in, because we have to decide, do we want to click on this link or not? So as we read with hypertext, text with links, the studies show that our understanding of the text, our comprehension of the text, tends to go down. And there have been lots of actual experiments, particularly with students, where they'd read something just as a book text, plain text, and then read that same thing as hypertext with links in it, and then take a reading comprehension test. And with links, comprehension goes down.
What's interesting is that in college classrooms these days, professors are allowing laptops, and the students are sitting there taking their notes into their laptops, but they're not just doing that. They're on the web, they're instant messaging, they're checking their email. Right. There's that's kind of scary.
Yeah, and it's unfortunately, in a lot of education, particularly higher education, there's this assumption that the more access to technology a student has, the better. And yet, what happens is exactly what you said. You open your laptop and you start to go out and do what everybody else does. Check your Facebook page. Look at a YouTube video. And there was a very interesting test at one college, experiment at one college, where they split a class into two groups. One group was able to open up their laptop, the other had to keep it closed, and then after the lecture they gave a test for how well they understood that lecture. And as you'd expect, the people who were distracted by their laptop performed much worse on the test.
Right.
But what was also interesting was it didn't matter whether they were looking at sites that were related to the lecture or not. Even if you look at relevant information, the distraction is still there and your comprehension goes down.
That's why I can't imagine these online universities succeeding in teaching people anything, you know?
Yeah.
But I do want to ask you about kids' brains and teens. Obviously, teens spend a lot of time online. Are these effects more intense because their brains are still developing?
I think it's a mixed picture. On the one hand, because young people's brains are still developing, they're very flexible. And so you can see kids, go from playing a video game or instant messaging to sitting down with a long book, a Harry Potter book or something, in getting lost in it. And that shows you how flexible a kid's brain is. What worries me is that recently we've seen a big increase in kids being bombarded with information. And that's mainly from texting, which has really exploded among teenagers in the last few years. Also in the rise of social networking and Facebooking, where you get constant, small interruptions of your thought with bits of information. So, I'm starting to fear that by basically keeping our children today from a very young age and in this kind of perpetual state of information bombardment, we're not giving them the opportunity to develop the types of thinking that require a high degree of concentration and attentiveness, and maybe they won't develop those at all.
The book we're discussing is called The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. Author Nicholas Carr is my guest. We typically, when we talk about kids, we lump TV and internet together into what's called screen time. And we talk about trying to limit screen time. But does TV have the same effect on kids' brains that online time does?
I think too much of either of those is probably not a good thing. But I think there are differences. With TV, at least for most of the time, we segregate it in our lives and we see it as a means of entertainment. And it doesn't necessarily push away all the other activities we do. Increasingly, as our cell phones become more powerful, and even small children now have often very powerful cell phones that allow them to do computing, the difference is that we no longer segregate the digital media type of technology to a particular time of day. It's not just an entertainment technology. It's kind of with us increasingly all the time, interrupting our thoughts, sending us messages. And, there are plenty of good things about that. You can stay in touch with your friends all the time and stuff, and it's very enjoyable. But I think it has a more, in a way, even though kids still spend more time looking at TV than looking at a computer, I think the computer may, in the end, have deeper effects on their thinking than the TV did.
Why is that? Because it's interactive? Because we can respond to things?
Because it's kind of always there. So if you're trying to do homework, say, on a computer, which is more and more the scenario that kids have, you're also probably have some instant message windows going. You're checking some Facebook updates. You're looking at a gaming site or something. And so it kind of embeds itself in all of our other activities, even those activities that really should be done in a quieter, more solitary, more attentive way, like studying and like homework.
Now, you say this in the book: what we're not doing while we're online also has neurological consequences. What are those?
I think what we're not doing is stepping back from the flow of information and thinking deeply about things, engaging in the kinds of thought that we call contemplation or introspection or reflection, or even deep reading, deep attentive reading. As we move forward with technological progress, there seems to be ever less time to engage in those more attentive and often solitary ways of thinking, because we're always juggling so many things. And if we don't practice them, then we're going to lose those skills. And I think you wouldn't want to spend all your time sitting in a room thinking big thoughts, but it's good to use your mind in different ways.
But that's true. But when people are writing for the net, and they're writing for that new kind of brain that just doesn't focus on things for a long time, where are we going to find that? I mean, we just have to read the classics from now on?
Well, it's a good question, if that's another example of how writing practices and information formation practices follow the habits of the audience. And it becomes kind of a cycle where it becomes harder and harder to break out of it, because you're being fed information in ever smaller bits and bytes and ever more quickly. And the danger is you kind of forget that there actually is a different way to think that is also very valuable.
So the bottom line, Nick, is the internet making us stupid? I mean, are we less intelligent than our pre-internet ancestors?
I think we're more scattered and we're more superficial in our thinking. I think the net helps us with certain ways of thought, with the ones that require a lot of connections, bouncing a lot of ideas off people, and that's important. But we never think deeply anymore about one thing, and that steals away from us, I think, a very important aspect of our minds.
So we're stupider?
A lot of us are.
The book is The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. It's published by W.W. Norton. Nicholas Carr, C-A-R-R, is the author. Nick, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thanks for inviting me.
Up next, how pornography is hijacking our sexuality. You're listening to The Mimi Geerges Show on the web at mgshow.org.